One of the problems with the consumer is our lack of understanding of energy. And our ignorance fosters the commercialization of energy. The money, the fact that you have to buy a rock, that is owned by somebody whose land is now considered property ownership of that owner. And so you just can't pick up the rock and take it with you as you walk along your way. You got to get permission from the owner and if he's willing to, buy the rock from him. Yet energy does not exist in space. Space exists in energy as a consequence of energy coming together, because energy is not a rock. Energy is a union, a marriage between different entities or factors, shall we say, that are totally temporal. They're exclusively temporal in their existence. And these factors are just binary. They're just two of them, but they are totally dependent on time alone, exclusively, without any occurrence of space. Space is a consequence of the union of these two opposites. So when we consider the fabric of the universe actually does not exist in space. Space has nothing to do with it. It's opposites existing in time. That's it. And we know that all matter is equivalent to energy. So when we look at this definition of energy from this standpoint, then we see that matter is the union of these factors of energy. And space is the consequence, along with matter and gravity and inertia and a momentum and all of the things that we take for granted are consequential. They are not formative. They are not essential or fundamental because they're not causative. We don't know how much proto energy there is in the universe. There's no way to measure. You can't measure because this proto energy I speak of is what electrical engineers are already familiar with, and physicists. It's called reactive power, reactance. Yet it doesn't react. Well, okay, let me back up. It does react. In fact, its essential nature is a wild stallion. See, I prefer to call it a wild stallion, but the conventional term is reactance. It's so wild, all it wants to do is react. And that's only when it interacts with its opposite. Because normally, it floats around in space, or it floats around in time, I should say. See, I have the same problem everybody else does. I think the wrong way about this. It exists in time as an element to itself that's a force that's not energy. Yet it's so reactionary that it prefers to remain a bachelor or a bachelorette. And it's not that easy to get them to come together. What does it take to make a marriage? It takes cooperation, which involves sacrifice. And what's being sacrificed? Some of the wild nature, some of the reactive nature of energy has to be sacrificed. So when we look at the four quadrant of energy, the four quadrant of power factors, we have positive power factors, that's one quadrant. Then we have two quadrants of zero power factors that come in two forms. And then we have the fourth quadrant, which is negative power factor. Now, negative power factor is what I focus on because that's where all the free energy comes from. Positive power factor is what everybody else focuses on because that's what appliances need. They can't operate on anything other than positive power factor. And zero power factor is the nature of the universe. That's what dominates. Even though conceptually, in terms of the conceptual model of power factor, we say that's half the AC cycle. it's either capacitive reactance is one quadrant, or it's inductive reactance. That's the other quadrant. But that's only conceptually speaking half of the existence of energy. In terms of actual quantity, it's the dominant energy of the universe, proto energy. It's energy that you can't use in any of your appliances, yet it's the only energy that dominates the universe, is this proto energy that exists as a bachelor and a bachelorette. And until we get them to come together, Ohm's law does not exist. Ohm's law only exists when we get capacitive reactance and inductive reactance to come together and coexist as a union that is so binding it creates a multiplicative mathematical relationship of one times the other to get the actual power of energy that our appliances are going to either consume if it's positive power factor or generate if it's negative power factor. But until they come together, we can't generate any power, and nor can we consume it. They have to come together in a union, a cooperative venture, in which they sacrifice some of their reactance in order to cooperate and function under Ohm's law. It's the only law of electrical engineering I understand, and let me tell you, from the layperson's standpoint, it's the only one you have to understand energy. Because energy is not a log you can burn and consume and use up and then go have to buy another log. It's a great model born of, what's the word I'm looking for? Corporate mentality, commercial mentality, that you have to keep paying through the nose for energy when all you have to do is clone it. Because the background radiation, the radiant energy that Tesla... See, here's another problem we have. Steinmetz was the first true engineer. Although Oliver Heaviside preceded him, and without Oliver Heaviside, which is pretty much, I'm going to get to in a minute, is the whole reason for my success in understanding free energy. It was Steinmetz who made it, who made energy engineerable. And he gave us terminology we did not have. Tesla had his terminology, and we don't necessarily use it unless you're into New Age stuff. And then we get this division between camps of people who believe in their own terminology, not realizing they're talking about the same thing. I actually got into an argument with somebody over the use of terms alone. It's so easy just to get over an argument over the use of words alone. It's unbelievable. But the fact is, reactance is radiant energy. And capacitive reactance is the most powerful between the two. Between inductive and capacitance, I'll take capacitance any day. It's the most wild of the two wild stallions, of the yang and the yin. It's probably the yang. Even though we don't call electrostatics yang, we call it yin. But it's the most powerful, is the yin. Because in that sleepy state, or in that sleepy domain of the dielectrical material, the insulator, sandwiched between two plates of a capacitor, is the most potent source of energy you can possibly imagine. It is humongous. It's not like a battery. It's not a storehouse of energy. It's the synthesis of energy. And that storehouse actually exists in a coil of wire, in the space between the windings, because the wire is insulated. And as you wrap the wire around a bobbin to create a coil, you've got spacing in between each wire. It's there. It's always there, because you have to have insulation or else the coil would short itself and be useless. So you're going to have spacing in between each wire, and it's just a question of what spacing you have will determine the capacitance of that coil. So even coils carry capacitance. Unfortunately, they also have inductance, and that tends to undermine the efficiency of the coil to synthesize electricity because of its back EMF. It just chews up energy like crazy. So it's a great consumer device, and we use it for powering our motors. So it kind of makes sense that an inductor dominates in the ability to be a consumer component to motorize our life, to move it, to get it to move by consuming energy, while capacitors are great at mostly focusing on the production of energy because they don't consume it a whole lot. Oh, it's there. They consume a little, but not a whole lot. When we talk about losses, it's always about hysteresis, in a transformer, because you're not going to get the same kind of losses in an air core coil that you will in an iron core coil, but you're not going to get the power in an air core coil motor that you will get in an iron core coil motor. So there's these sacrifices, these choices we make when we look at consumption versus production of energy. But when it comes to production, we have to go back to the source of energy, and that's the background radiation in the universe that's proto radiation. It's not electromagnetic radiation. This is proto radiation, what Tesla called radiant energy, what Steinmetz, who came right after Tesla, called reactance. It's the reactance, what electrical engineers are already familiar with, but they say, well, it's useless. You can't use it for anything. Well, no, duh. Not until you marry the two and get the two to cooperate under Ohm's law will you get power. Until you get them to sacrifice a little bit of, or a lot, depending, of their reactance, of their radiance, their radiant energy. See, this is the confusion. We use some words for multiple meanings. We have electromagnetic radiation, and then we have Tesla's radiant energy, which is Steinmetz's reactance, which has nothing to do with electromagnetic radiation. So it creates a contradictory confusion of terms, unfortunately. And then we have electricity, and we have the dielectric, which is electrostatics, which is the yin, the most powerful of the two reactances. So we have a confusion of terms, making it impossible to communicate on this subject in any intelligible fashion. My job is to make sense and sort out these difficulties and lay it out plain for you to see. Our communication is the biggest stumbling block, by far, bar none, by far, bar none, by far. Because conventional wisdom already has all the knowledge they could possibly ever need to create all the energy they could possibly want to service the consumer sector. They just have the undying belief that it's useless, that you can't marry the two opposite zero power factored reactances of capacitive and inductive reactance to get a union under Ohm's law to power our motors and light up our light bulbs and heat up our homes. They can't possibly imagine you could do that. They keep calling it reactance, a byproduct of Steinmetz's understanding and legacy, that it's the effect, not the cause. And that's where their conventional wisdom falls apart, and where we have to help them understand that reactance is the cause, it's not the effect. It's where all of our energy comes from. The whole universe is filled with nothing but reactance dominating the scene. And the quantity of positive power factor energy existing in the universe is so marginal you can't even enumerate how many zeros to the right of the decimal point it would take to evaluate how much positive power factor, usable, real or actual power there is in the universe by comparison in a ratio proportion to the actual background radiant energy, if you prefer to call it, or reactance, if you prefer to call it, that exists. Because the reactance by far dominates the universe. It's unbelievable how much there is. And we don't know how much there is because you can't measure reactance. You can't. You can only measure its consequence, namely its union. You have to put it in an artificial framework. It's like grounding. In order to determine that you're grounded to the earth when you connect your earthing bedsheet to the earth by a single open line, is you have to create a reference, another open line, to serve as your reference to create a closed loop. And then you look to see if you have any resistance within that closed loop to know whether or not your earthing bedsheet is grounded to the earth or not. You know, do you have all your connections solidly connected, conducting electricity in your closed loop test loop? This is your test loop. But when you sleep at night, you get rid of the reference. You don't want that. All you want is your single open line connecting you to the earth through a single piece of wire. One end goes to you, well, to your bedsheet that you lay on, and the other end of that wire goes to a grounding rod in the earth outside your home, passing out through your window, hopefully, and bypassing and avoiding the use of your house wiring. If you know it's good for you, you avoid that. But be that as it may, it's an open line connection to the earth. But the only way to know that you have that connection, solidly conducting the balancing of voltage potentials between you and the earth, because there's no current going on. There's current leakage, but no current movement per se, because all you're getting is a migration of electrons to balance out the voltage potentials between you and the earth. So there's no current to electrocute you, but to know that you have a connection, you have to create a second line and connect one end of that second line to your earthing bedsheet and the other one to your grounding, or to the earth actually, not to your grounding rod, but to the earth somewhere else nearby your grounding rod. And through the earth will form the loop, the connection. And then you measure the resistance, if there is any. If there's no resistance, you know, your meter will tell you. It'll say no response, and then you don't have a closed loop. You have to have a closed loop to indicate that you had a grounding connection in the first place. This is when you're testing to see whether or not you have a grounding connection to your earthing bedsheet. You know, earthing.com, earthinginstitute.net. Get an education, because these are basic things to know about from the layperson's perspective, which is my perspective. I'm just a journalist. I'm acting like a journalist. I investigate a new topic to discover what's wrong with our majority opinion on the subject. We've been manipulated for a few vested interests who want to make a buck off of us to keep us ignorant on the topic. And that includes electrical engineers, because they have a belief that capacitive and inductive reactance is not the dominant energy in the universe, and you can't get anything useful out of it, because they don't know you can marry the two in a framework of time, whose byproduct is space, and the matter that comes with space, and the gravity that comes with matter. They don't know this. And so consequently, if they don't know it, then we don't know it. But in order to know, getting back to the earthing, in order to know you have a connection, you have to create this closed loop. And so your meter will say, it'll either say you don't have a connection, you know, you don't have anything to read, and so you know you don't have a connection, or it'll tell you you have so much resistance, or it'll tell you you have zero resistance. In either case, you know you've got a connection to the earth. And then you disconnect your reference line, and you go back to just sleeping on your earthing bedsheet, knowing that you're connected to the earth. You may be sensitive enough to feel whether or not you have a connection. You know, if you really need to be grounded, you'll know. You don't need a meter to tell you. But if you need to know, then that's the procedure you use. So you see, you created a union between two grounding lines in order to find out if one of them was working. And your second one, you have to assume that it's working, or else well, your meter will tell you whether or not your assumption is correct or not. When you first set it up, though, you have to assume, well, it's going to work, or else why would I not choose it, you know? But your meter will tell you, and if it doesn't, then you know that one or the other is not working, but you won't know which one. Unless you know for certain that your reference line works, then you'll know that, well, if I don't have a closed loop, then there's something wrong with my earthing connection. So you see, you see what I'm trying to allude to is I guess I have to admit that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle comes out of the fact that all energy, not just some energy, but all energy comes out of a union of opposites in a framework of time. All energy. It doesn't matter whether it's mechanical, electrical, optical, what else is there? Gravity. Doesn't matter. Nuclear power. Doesn't matter. It all comes down to the same construction. Whether your terminology is different, your frame of reference or of consideration, your domain of interest is different, doesn't matter. It's still the same structure. Study one and you know the fundamental behavioral characteristics of all of it. It's just a question of getting familiar with each domain is going to be a little different in its outward appearance, but fundamentally it's the same. Yang and yin in a framework of time. That's all it amounts to. That's the one thing missing from yang and yin is a framework of time. Without time, it's useless to even consider the foundation of energy, because you have to have time. You don't need space, because space is a consequence of the union of yang and yin in a framework of time, along with the consequence of gravity and matter and so forth, and inertia. But you have to have time first, and then you have to have yang, and you have to have yin, and you have to have them come together in a union, which means they have to cooperate, they have to sacrifice some of their wild reactance, and their union is tenuous. You know what marriage is like. Unless you get a rare case, which is rare these days, of two people who stay together a lifetime because their union is so perfect. You get a marriage that statistically is, I don't want to claim to know statistics of marriage between two people because I really don't. But in my grandmother's day, you know, two people stayed together whether they could stand to live with each other or not. For the sake of the children, they always stayed together, usually. But in my parents' day, that's a whole different animal. They lasted 10 years. My brother, his first marriage lasted 10 years. So regardless of the excuses we make for marrying, the rationale, a lot of them don't last. They're very tenuous. And why? Because they require communication, cooperation, sacrifice, respect for each other, respect for oneself. Hey, it doesn't pay if you're being abused. How long is that relationship going to last if you're being abused by your mate? How long will it take for you to wake up and realize that they're not respecting you the way you respect yourself? So there has to be some cooperation, some similitude between the two of you as to how you go about respecting yourselves and along with each other, or else the cooperation is not going to last very long. Energy is no different. The union of the factors, of the proto energy factors that go to make up energy as we know it, you know, power that we consume or generate, is a very tenuous relationship. Just like a marriage, it could fall apart in a heartbeat if we don't keep maintaining it. So we actually have to do a certain amount of work to service energy to make sure its union continues to maintain itself. Otherwise, it goes back to the universe where it came from, and it, for all intents and purposes, becomes invisible. That's when we say it has been destroyed, because energy is merely the union of yang and yin in a framework of time. And so, yeah, we destroyed energy because what did we do? We destroyed the union between the two singular factors of energy that couldn't stay together in time long enough for us to make use of it to be satisfactory. You know, once we're done with it, we don't care what it does. But while we want to use it, we care that it lasts. It's just like the child cares that at least so long as the child loves his parents and is dependent on his parents for their love, because the child is not ready yet to go out into the world and get love from himself, get love from other people. He's dependent on his parents for that love. And he wants to make sure they stay together. It's not in his best or her best interest that the parents should fall out of love. So that union only matters so long as we want to make use of that energy. But the energy is not a log, it's not a piece of coal, it's not a piece of uranium that you can consume. Those are merely storehouses of energy. Nuclear storehouse, chemical of the log, or of a battery storehouse. Those are just storehouses of energy. That's not energy. That's a warehouse, or a mini warehouse, I should say, of energy. But it's not energy itself. And we can... Well, I don't know why we confuse the two, the storehouse with the energy that is stored in the storehouse. Because when you think back to the days of ancient, well, not ancient, but because ancient Egypt was really, it had so many thousands of years to its history that in the latter stages of its history, let's put it that way, the stages that we're familiar with, they pooled all their grain in a singular warehouse run by the priests, and it was called a temple. The temple of the priests was the storehouse for all their grain, because they had to, ration it during times of famine, and they had to store it, because every few years they'd get a drought condition in which the Nile River would deplete, and you wouldn't get a flooding of the plains, the farmers' fields surrounding the Nile River. And so they'd have a drought condition, they couldn't grow anything, and they'd have to go to the temple to survive that year and maybe the next year. So the temple priest's job was to store grain for some future date in which they would have to have enough grain on hand to feed everybody for at least 1 year, if not a couple of years. Isn't that what Joseph told the Pharaoh in Egypt to do? That's what they were doing, They already figured that out. They didn't need some guy telling them to do that. They already figured it out. It's just a Jewish story, that's in the Bible. Oh, the Jews are responsible for telling them, the Egyptians, how to run their lives. They already knew how. They've been there long enough to know that's the cycles of the Nile River. You got to have a storehouse. So they didn't have a commercialization. There was no way you could get away with free enterprise or commercialization or corporations. It wouldn't exist, because you had to cooperate. You had to have a socialistic framework to society in which the priests were in charge. So in a sense it was communist, because they were in charge of the property of the grain, the food that everybody needed to survive. So in a sense it was communist, not socialist. No, it was communist, because they possessed the property right to that grain. You grew it, but they owned it. Once you harvested it, it was their property, because they were in charge of managing to make sure that everybody got it during the lean years of a drought. That was pretty tough living there. As much as the Nile River gave them so much sustenance, sometimes it gave them nothing. So I'm saying here that they had no cause to mistake the wheat that they ate for the temple that they went to go worship and pay homage and respect to the priests who were in charge of their food supply. They didn't have the facility to mix up the two, but we do. We mix up the grid with the energy that flows through it. And the grid has become our temple, and our authority figures, the priests of that temple that we go to, and we pay through the nose the harvest of our work, our money, to pay for that energy so that we can heat our homes and so forth. And yet energy doesn't work that way. Our society works that way, but that's not the way energy works. And free energy is simply knowing where energy comes from, that you can go and get your own. The forest of proto energy is out there and in here, and it's everywhere. It's everywhere in the universe. And we don't know how much of it there is, but we do know that if we spent all of it all at once, the universe would explode. And that's the only limitation we have to worry about, is the explosion of a circuit when it marries too much capacitive reactance with inductive reactance to get power per unit time. You know, it's always per unit time. So if it marries just the right amount of energy, then we have a happy medium in which to synthesize electricity at a rate that we can consume and not blow up the circuit, not fry it, cook it to oblivion, nor the opposite extreme, watch as it goes and becomes comatose, just like a drought condition of the Nile River, and give us nothing to speak of. It'll be a little flicker there, but nothing to sneeze at. So we want that middle ground, that happy middle ground of the Zen Buddhist between one extreme and the other. You know, it's born of the knowledge of yang and yin, the knowledge of opposites within a framework of time that gives them that attitude to walk down the middle path. Now the Vedic has the same terminology, the same conceptualization, but different terminology to go with it. Time is bliss. It's Ananda. It's the basis for their yang and yin, which is Sat and Chit. Sat is their yang, and Chit is their yin. Because when you go to the I Ching, and you look at the 8 trigrams of the I Ching, there are 2 of them that are primary importance. Qian and Kahun, or if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Qian is Sat. It's energy, it's creative force, it's yang, because it's all 3 solid lines to the trigram. Well, Kun, or Kahun, depending on how you're supposed to pronounce it, is the yin. It's the receptive, it's the darkness, it's the intelligence, it's the chit, it's the empty void. Well, Qian is the fullness. 2 fullnesses. Fullness of fullness, fullness of emptiness. Purnamida, Purnamidam. 2 fullnesses, and out of which comes all of this fullness, and to which all of this fullness returns, and you take fullness from fullness, and what remains is more fullness. So from the Vedic standpoint, you would think the energy is limitless, and it just might be. We don't know that from a scientific standpoint, and there's no way we can determine that from a scientific standpoint. It's impossible. It's impossible to measure yang by itself, and it's impossible to measure yin by itself. It's impossible to measure the capacitive reactance of the universe by itself and know how much of it there is, and it's impossible to measure inductive reactance in the universe by itself as it is, to know how much of each there is in the universe. It's impossible. It's non-deterministic. So we don't know how much proto energy there is in the universe. It's impossible to know. All we know is there are certain limits. There's a temporal limit of time in which the union comes together, in which you have to maintain that union within the framework of time in order to get anything useful out of it. And then there's the limit of how much union per unit of time can your circuit tolerate, and how much do you need. So you have to go down that middle path of staying within tolerance, but also adequate to satisfy your need. So we have this forest of trees, and they don't exist in space. When it comes to energy, they exist in time. And we go in the forest and we cut down all the male trees that we need and all the female trees that we need, and we bring them home and we put them together in our fireplace to create a union of fire to heat our home. And we burn that fire, and now we have to go out and get more, because it's a temporal relationship. It's not something that exists in space that we pay for. It's a temporal relationship, because once we make use of that energy, when we're done making use of it, we don't pay attention to it anymore And you know what? It's liable to fall apart. Because it takes management to keep it together. It takes cooperative management to keep it together in a per unit time. That's what I mean by within a framework of time, per unit of time. It means the same thing. So we have to understand these fundamental basics of energy in order to understand how do we go about using energy in a holistic perspective, which has nothing to do with the commercialization of energy. That's an artificial fabrication of a few vested interests who want to keep us dumbed down, keep us ignorant, to keep making money off of us, so that they're in charge of our social universe instead of each man and each woman being in charge of their own life. It makes them, it fills their ego with pride to say to themselves, I did a good thing. I managed other people's lives. And we're doing pretty good, aren't we? It gives them a great lift. And you can imagine it would give me a great lift too if I was in their shoes. It would give anybody a big lift. But it's a game. And it's a game that most people in the industrialized countries of the world are willing to put up with. To work to live, rather than live to work. When you work to live, you got to slave for that buck to pay for the energy. Or else you're not going to eat tonight, you're not going to sleep well tonight. You're going to be in a box on some street corner somewhere, or in the woods, with a makeshift tent, trying to eke out a living. Back to the pioneer days. So we chose to cooperate in our society by sacrificing awareness of how things work, and instead take up this religious belief, this religious conviction about conservation of energy, which only pertains to Ohm's law. It's a tenuous thing. Conservation of energy has a loophole in it. If you read the definition of the conservation of energy, it only exists so long as time does not shift. The minute time shifts, conservation of energy is invalid, and it's not a consideration anymore. So even conservation of energy has its limitations. Its limitation is it has to exist within a framework of time. So already it's alluding to what energy has to do. Exist within a framework of time. They both serve the same master. Conservation of energy and energy, the proto energy that I speak of, both play lip service and kiss ass to time. Time is the ultimate ass to kiss. Because if you don't, you can forget it. You're not going to get matter, you're not going to get energy, you're not going to get space, you're not going to get gravity, you're not going to get anything without time. Yet time by its nature is eternal. It's the eternal now. There is no future. There is no past. As far as time is concerned, it's only space that creates this fiction of yesterday and tomorrow. And will I have enough tomorrow to take care of myself? We don't know, do we? But from the standpoint of time alone, tomorrow does not exist as a separation from today, from now. Now is eternal. It's all-consuming. It consumes the whole of time. The eternal now is eternal for a reason, because it has no boundaries. It has no division. The only reason why we think there's a tomorrow or a yesterday is because we go to sleep and lose consciousness. Yet there are a few rare individuals on this planet who, despite the fact that their body sleeps, they remain awake inside 24/7 all the time. That's called enlightenment. And there's even a few more rare individuals whose bodies never go to sleep. They are awake 24/7, totally. And Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's master, his guru, was one of those individuals, one of those case examples of somebody who never sleeps. Now Maharishi did go to sleep, but only for 2 hours. Yet it was his body that slept. And most of his senses, except for his hearing, he would tell people, don't mind me, I have to go off and take a nap here, but keep reading to me the news of the day. He wanted to he wanted to see, keep tabs on how things were going in the human universe. So he would have people read him all the newspaper stories while his body slept. His mind was still awake and his ears were awake to hear what he was being told. So his mind was constantly functioning and his ears were constantly functioning, at the very least. I don't know about his other senses, but we know from the stories that we've been told that at least his ears were functioning when he slept at night along with his mind. And he'd have people read him all the newspaper articles of current events so he could keep tabs on how people's consciousness, world consciousness, was forming and formulating, so that he could plan a strategy for how to sell TM to help improve world consciousness and create world peace. So he had a vast interest in global economy, global factors of life, the values of life, the quality of life. Yet he didn't have to sleep. His mind didn't need to sleep. And his ears, his sense of hearing, did not need any rest. But his body needed to rest. Only 2 hours. Now when I go to sleep, I'm oblivious to the world around me. And so that creates a division, a loss of consciousness, and a break in time between today and yesterday. And that makes me think of this illusory factor that time moves forward, which is an illusion. It doesn't move forward, it stands still, it's always now. And I know this from personal experience because when I was a teenager, I transcended this loss of consciousness during sleep at night when the body sleeps. And I only needed to sleep 4 hours. It was a 4-month period in which I was a 19-year-old. At the end of my 2 years of fasting, 3 years of doing transcendental meditation, and I was drinking gobs of wheatgrass juice when I broke my fast. And I was awake 24/7, but my body needed to sleep for 4 hours every night, and it needed to meditate twice a day for 20 minutes, morning and evening. So for that 4 hours and 40 minutes, that was all the rest my body needed. But the rest of the time, I was active. I had to be doing something. I had to get a job just to find some way to spend the energy because I didn't need the money, and I didn't need the experience, and I didn't care what job I got, just so long as it was manual labor to involve my body, and it was miles away from my home. So I had to at first walk long distances, and then eventually when I got used to walking, I took my bike and rode there and got there much quicker and had more time to spend at home doing things and less time walking, which was fine with me. I didn't need the time to daydream while walking. I had plenty of time riding my bike to daydream. But all I needed was a job to spend my energy because I had so much energy and a wakefulness that was non-ceasing. It never ceased. During those 4 months, it was a transitory period of time that I failed to stabilize, but it gave me a glimpse of what enlightenment is. And it's quite awesome because you start seeing things that nobody else sees. You see people's thoughts written all over their faces. When we say, oh, it was written all over your face, that's how I could figure out what you were thinking. It's more truth than fiction. It's just like one of these moving message displays, the light bulbs, and they turn on and off, and the message appears to be moving across a strip of these light bulbs. That's literally the way thought ripples across somebody's face. If you can see thought in a person's aura, you will see it move across their face like a wave rippling, moving, a ripple of wave moving across the surface of a lake. And you literally read the thought right off the surface of their face, if they're not hiding it, if they're not pushing emotion out in front of their thought to hide their thought with their emotion. So then all you see is the emotion instead of the thought that they're thinking, because they're very self-conscious and they're afraid somebody's going to find out what they're thinking, they got some dirty secret they got to keep to themselves or something. Who cares? When you're busy reading people's thoughts, you couldn't care less. It's only people who think, which is most everybody, who could think in terms of privacy. They think they have some sort of privacy to their thoughts and feelings. Ultimately, they don't, because if anything, you're going to be able to read their emotions. And if you have the ability to translate emotions into thought, you're going to figure out what they were thinking anyway. But anyway, I'm a little off topic, but I have to give you a backdrop here, because unless you understand that the soul exists in time as a mortal being who does not live in space and who has to vicariously learn lessons that it can't learn in a framework of time alone because it can't be tested. We're only tested in a framework of space. So it has to associate itself loosely at first, gradually a little bit more of strongly a union, with each incarnation of a creature, a humanized animal, us. It has to associate with us for one of our lifespans to vicariously learn from us, or vicariously extract from us at the time of our death, whatever we managed to learn during the course of our lifespan. And if it was just material knowledge, okay, that's worth something. But if it was spiritual knowledge, if we actually learned a karmic lesson and we express some of the divinity that stands behind the soul, because the soul is really just a portal uniting two opposite extremes, a divine self, an Atma, an ideal self, a guardian angel, and this humanoid being that walks around with five senses and a mind. And that portal is the union between the two. And that portal exists in time as a mortal being. And it has an obligation to itself to gain what it cannot gain of its own effort. It has to get it vicariously from us upon our death, when it extracts all the memory and judges what we've done. Good, bad, and indifferent. Doesn't matter. It just reels it off like a backwards running movie in the course of 3.5 days, as it extracts all of this memory from every single cell in our body. Because our entire body is our mind. It's not focused on our brain. Our brain is just the conscious, it holds the conscious thinking part, and the emotions too. But the body is the subconscious mind. And it has memory too. And all of it has to be extracted. It takes 3.5 days to do it, which is why it's a good idea to leave the body alone for 3.5 days before you do anything to it. And unfortunately, that's not the case. The people who are so interested in preparing the body for death do so immediately, and that messes things up for the soul, as far as the soul is concerned, because it adds in memories that don't belong there, They have nothing to do. It's not the person's fault. He didn't put them there. It's somebody else. Once he's dead, he doesn't have any control over what people do to his body. So it has nothing to do. It doesn't gain the soul anything to have to extract those memories along with everything else that the person put there. So it just confuses them. It muddies the waters. You really have to let the body. You just put it in the cold storage for 3.5 days, and you leave it alone. 4 days if you're not sure of the time of death. Just round up to the nearest day. Make it 4 days. Add a day if you have to. But leave it in cold storage until you do anything to it. And I mean anything. Autopsy, burial preparation, anything. You just leave it alone. But the soul has to take all those memories and take it out of the body. Because it lives in time. It doesn't live in space. We live in space and time. But it lives in time alone. So the soul knows all about this. If you had the perspective of the soul, of your soul, you would fully understand electrical dynamics once it was taught to you. You would say, oh, I know this already. I know this. I'm familiar with this. Because this is stuff that my soul is already familiar with. It's all about time. Opposites functioning in a framework of time as a union, a cooperative union, a joint venture between two opposites, but in a framework of time. It's a trilogy. It's a what do they call it in the Catholic religion? A triad of sorts. What's the word? well, I can't think of it at the moment. I'm obviously not raised a Christian, even though that was one of my parents, but be that as it may. In fact, one of my grandparents was a minister, but be that as it may, it's not my upbringing, so I can't think of the word. A trinity. It's a trinity of principles. You know, you've got the Holy Ghost, which is Ananda, bliss, that's the time. And then you got the Father, which is the Yang, the creative force, the Qian, the energy, the Sat, the fullness. And then you've got, am I saying that right? Yeah, it would have to be. No, wait a minute. Shoot. No, I guess not. I guess the void, the yin, is the Holy Ghost. And the sun is the, oh shoot. No, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Wait a minute. That means that the sun is empty space. Now that makes sense. Holy, that is weird. Oh no. So that actually is alluding to the fact that yang actually comes before yin. So which is which then? If all the power comes out of capacitive reactance, I'm tempted to think that that's yang. Because it's the insulator of the wire where all the power is located, not in the wire itself. But see, that would be related to space, though. The insulation is similar to the vacuum of space, so that won't do. I think it's the other way around, actually. Yin is the Father, and the Sun is the Yang. Because all we ever focus on is the male anyway, right? The creative, the energy. We even talk about it that way. We're not interested in space, we're interested in energy. You know, it's confusing, obviously. It doesn't help. Religion hasn't helped. It just makes it more confusing. So we'll just have to leave that alone. I love to integrate, and I try to integrate as much as I can. But when it comes to religion, it gets too confusing to even bother trying. Because religion is mostly a myth anyway. It's a lot of dogma and creed and beliefs, and it's not founded in experience. It's founded in what? Inspiration without experience to back it up. It's purely religion is purely the byproduct of inspiration. Intuition, inspiration, devotion, you know, it has nothing to do with experience. Experience might come out of religion, but it doesn't back it up. See, science takes the opposite view, that you need experience to back up your beliefs. While religion says, no, you just have a belief and that backs up your experience. So, yeah, that's why we can't. Both operate in a triune framework of trilogies or of trinities, but they each have their own domain because they're opposite in how they go about approaching experience versus knowledge. And that's why we can't really integrate the two and make equivalences that have any meaning, have any relevance to each other. It's impossible, because they totally approach our life from totally opposite vantage points. Experience based on knowledge, or knowledge based on experience. You know, Saraswati and the goddess of wisdom in Vedic lore, and Adi Shankara, the first Shankara of India, had an argument. Which is greater? Which is superior, knowledge or experience? And Adi, being an intellectual, well-versed in the Vedas and whatnot, he was arguing for knowledge is superior to experience. And Saraswati was going, experience is superior to knowledge. And she must have won the argument somehow, because he ended up agreeing with her of sorts, because we're told that he left his body with his disciples in a state of trance, vacated his body, because he didn't have that much power, like some saints, some yogis have. So in order to vacate his body and occupy the body of another person, he had to put his body into a trance state and tell his disciples to look after it. The body was in the hut in a trance state, and just make sure it's left alone, basically. And he said, I'll be away for 1 month's time, and then I'll return. And he went into the body of a dead king nearby who had recently died. He just collapsed and died right there, and probably a heart attack or a stroke or something. He revived the body, brought it back to life, and of course his counselors, the counselors of the king, I should say, were aghast, but then they figured out, what, this guy behaves differently. He's actually a nice guy. The king wasn't nice like this at all. And we've seen this story before, in The Prince and the Pauper, Mark Twain's story, where you get this transposition of elements, or The Man of the Iron Mask. Who was the guy who wrote that one in the 1800s? A French guy. Was it Dafoe? I can't remember. Anyway, there's all these stories in which people change places. It's a theme in the movies that happens frequently. People change places. Well, Adi Shankara took the body of this dead king, and he did so in order to know what it's like not to be celibate, because Adi Shankara was a lifelong celibate. So he didn't know what sex was, and he did not know what wealth was, and pomp and circumstance. So he took the life of a dead king because it would give him everything he needed in terms of experience that he had never had before. And once he got caught up with this, he forgot that he had a duty to return to his disciples. And they started getting antsy, like, where is he already, He said he was going to come back, and he hasn't come back. And meanwhile, the counselors to the dead king, who has been revived, realized what had happened, that we have a yogi in our midst. This is not the king. This is a yogi masquerading as the king. We have to go and find the body of this yogi and put it on the funeral pyre and burn it to make sure we keep this guy, because this is a cool dude. He actually gets things done. He's nice to people. He's efficient. He's intelligent. He's magnanimous. He's all the qualities the dead guy who left us did not possess. Plus, he's having a good time with all his consorts, all his concubines and whatnot, So, whatever. Hey, a kingly life, right? So he's having a good time, but he's a nice guy too. He's a good guy. So we got to keep him. So they're busy looking for the body to kill it, to burn it. Meanwhile, most of the disciples left and left one disciple behind to keep track of the body. And they went looking for where their master had gone to. And just as they arrive at the king to tell him what has happened, the king's counselors, or his soldiers, whatever, who went, they fetched the body, they got it out of the hut, They only had one disciple to overpower, so it was pretty easy to do if there were several of them. And they put it on the funeral pyre, and they were lighting the funeral pyre, and just as the flames were licking the body, the disciples reach their master in the body of the dead king and tell him, and he realizes, oops, I forgot I have another life and a duty. And so he dropped the king's body, who dies a second time, gets back into his own body, gets off the funeral pyre, and continues living out the remainder of his life as Adi Shankara. And it's a very interesting story, but it shows you that life is not the way our consumer-driven commercial existence has taught us. Our science is mostly a set of beliefs with a few facts thrown in for good measure. And it's there to convince us that our life as we know it is the way reality is, so that the status quo can be maintained for the benefit of those in charge who get the benefit of acting like gods. And so that phrase in Genesis, we have to kick Adam and Eve out of of the Garden of Eden, because now they have come to know good and evil, and they have become like one of us. They are now as gods, and we can't allow that to happen, so we have to kick them out. Doesn't that sound kind of stupid? Wouldn't you want to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and become as gods? Didn't they say that Adam walked and talked with God? Good grief, you know? I mean, there's a little element there in the Genesis story that sounds like it was put there by a bunch of humans who wanted to continue to control us and say, see, you're going to be you're like Adam and Eve. You don't get to be like us, the ones in charge. So I think I've said enough. And it's about time I call it quits on this little dissertation, but I had to put this out there. I had to say this because it's really vital, important knowledge. If you don't know this, then you can't imagine how to know about energy and why we have problems understanding each other and whatnot. This is important stuff, but it's basic stuff.